The evening was calm, the kind of evening most people look forward to after a long day. The sun had set, casting a warm glow over the world. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the city itself was ready to rest. A man and his wife were just finishing their errands, the day's to-do list almost completed. It was one of those rare moments when everything seemed to fall into place, when things just felt right. They had decided to stop at a gas station on their way home. It was a small, local place that they visited often, a pit stop they knew well. The lights of the station flickered in the dusk, and the faint hum of the pumps was the only sound that filled the air. They pulled in, the man behind the wheel, his wife sitting in the passenger seat. He turned off the engine and they both stepped out, the cool night air greeting them. The man looked over at his wife with a smile, watching her as she stretched, her arms reaching above her head. It had been a long day and they were both exhausted, but the simplicity of the moment made everything feel easy. She was always so full of life, always so positive, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for her presence in his life. They walked towards the pump, the man reaching for the nozzle. As he did, he heard the sound of a car pulling in beside them, followed by the noise of a door slamming shut. At first he thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another customer. But as he turned to face the pump, his eyes caught the sight of a police car. The vehicle was parked a little too close, and he noticed the officer stepping out, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Something about the officer's body language seemed off, the way he moved so quickly and with purpose. It was almost as if he had something to prove. The man, a retired Navy SEAL, was no stranger to tense situations. His training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, to assess every moment for potential threats. So when the officer approached them, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in his chest. The officer walked up to them, his gaze fixed firmly on the man. There was no greeting, no polite introduction, just a cold, direct stare. The man's instincts kicked in, and he shifted slightly, positioning himself so that he was between his wife and the officer. It wasn't that he felt threatened, not yet anyway, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "Can I help you, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm but cautious. He was trying to keep things friendly, trying to diffuse any tension before it had a chance to grow. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a moment to look them both over, as if assessing something deeper than just their appearances. Then, without a word, the officer's hand moved to the gun at his side and the man's heart skipped a beat. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked again, his voice firmer now. He could feel his wife's presence behind him, her quiet concern palpable. She was always so calm, so collected, but even she couldn't help but sense the change in the air. The officer's eyes never wavered. There was something in his expression, a coldness that didn't belong in this moment, in this place. "You're making me nervous," the officer finally said, his voice tight. "I don't like how you're standing." The man blinked, confused. "Excuse me," he said, trying to make sense of what the officer was implying. "I'm just getting gas, officer. There's no need for any trouble." The officer stepped closer, his hand still on the gun. The man's mind raced. He knew what this looked like. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize when things were about to spiral out of control. His military training had taught him how to keep a clear head, how to read people in situations in a split second. And right now, everything about this officer screamed danger. His eyes flicked to the side, catching his wife's worried expression. She had stepped back slightly, her body tense as she silently watched the exchange. The man's heart ached for her, but he knew he had to stay calm. He had to protect her. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Not here, not now. The officer took another step forward, his hand tightening around the gun. The man instinctively placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, pulling her a little closer to him. It was a small gesture, but one that sent a message. He was in control. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. "Officer, I'm not a threat," the man said, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Please, just let us finish what we're doing. There's no need for all this." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed and he took another step closer, the tension in the air thickening with every movement. The man's heart rate increased, his training kicking in as he prepared himself for whatever was about to come. But he didn't want to fight. He didn't want to escalate the situation any further. He just wanted to go home, step away from her. The officer barked suddenly, his voice rising. The man could see the officer's hand was now fully on the gun, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle. The officer's breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. The man's mind was racing, trying to figure out how to defuse the situation. He couldn't let the officer make the first move, not with his wife standing so close. His hand instinctively moved to his side, his body ready to react if needed, but he didn't want to strike first. He couldn't, that wasn't who he was. That wasn't what he had been trained to do. "Please," the man said again, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We're just here to get gas. That's all. I don't want any trouble," but it was too late. The officer's finger twitched, and before the man could even react, there was a sharp, loud sound that rang out in the stillness of the evening air. It wasn't the sound of a car engine or someone slamming a door. It was the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The man's heart stopped for a moment as he watched his wife fall to the ground in slow motion, her body crumpling in a heap at his feet. Blood spread out around her, staining the concrete. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as everything around him turned into chaos. He dropped to his knees beside her, instinctively reaching out to her, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the wound. His mind was racing, but everything seemed to move in slow motion. His wife's blood was on his hands. She was bleeding out right in front of him, and he didn't know how much time they had. He tried to remain calm, tried to remember what he had been taught. He had saved countless lives during his time as a Navy SEAL, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't a mission. This was real life. And it was his wife lying on the ground, her life slipping away with each passing second. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at the officer, his mind filled with rage and disbelief. The officer stood there, staring at them, seemingly unsure of what to do next. It was as if he had no idea the kind of mistake he had just made. But the man didn't care about the officer right now. His only focus was his wife. He had to save her. He couldn't let her die. The gunshot echoed in the air, its sound still vibrating in the man's ears. Time seemed to stand still. His heart was racing, but everything else felt like it was moving in slow motion. He looked down at his wife, her face pale, her body limp. Blood spread out from the wound, soaking into the asphalt beneath her. The world around him seemed to blur, the chaos of the situation fading into the background as his mind focused solely on her. He shook his head, as if to clear the fog that had settled in his thoughts. He couldn't afford to panic. He had been in life-or-death situations before, but nothing had ever felt like this. This was his wife, his best friend, fighting for her life in front of him. He had to do something. He had to act. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to steady them. He placed one hand on the wound, pressing down hard to slow the bleeding. His other hand went to his wife's face, brushing her hair back from her forehead. She was breathing, but her breaths were shallow, weak. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, her lips moving in a silent gasp, but she couldn't speak. She was struggling to stay conscious, and he could see the fear in her eyes. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice hoarse as he fought to keep the panic from taking over. "You're going to be okay. Just stay with me." The words felt empty as soon as they left his mouth, but he couldn't help himself. He needed her to hear him. He needed to believe it too. He pressed harder against her wound, hoping to buy enough time until help arrived, but the seconds seemed to drag on forever. Each one felt like a lifetime. The officer, still standing there frozen, hadn't moved. He was staring at them, his eyes wide in disbelief, as if he couldn't process what had just happened. The man wanted to scream at him, demand an explanation, but he couldn't take his eyes off his wife. She was slipping away from him with every second that passed, and he was the only one who could save her. "Help her," the man shouted, his voice breaking as he looked up at the officer. "You need to help her now." The officer didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, looking as if he were frozen in place. The man's mind was racing, thinking back to his training, trying to remember what to do in this kind of situation. He knew how to stabilize an injury. He had done it countless times during his time in the military. But this was different. This wasn't a fellow soldier. This wasn't a stranger he could push aside to save. This was his wife, the woman he loved, the person he would do anything to protect. The officer finally seemed to snap out of his daze, but instead of rushing to help, he took a step back. His hand still hovered near his gun, but the man could see the confusion and fear in the officer's eyes. I didn't mean," the officer stammered, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean to." The man didn't have time for apologies. He didn't have time for explanations. He needed help. He needed action. He shot a glance toward the gas station store, hoping to see someone coming to their aid. But the station was eerily quiet. There was no one in sight. It was just the officer, the man, and his wife, and that awful suffocating silence that hung in the air. He pressed harder on his wife's wound, trying to keep the blood from flowing too fast. His training had taught him how to handle situations like this, how to keep calm and think quickly. But in this moment, it all felt like a blur. His thoughts were scattered, his mind overwhelmed by the sight of her in his arms bleeding out. "Stay with me," he repeated, his voice more urgent now. He could see the way her eyes flickered, her body trembling as she fought to stay conscious. Her hand weakly grasped his and he squeezed it, offering what little comfort he could. The officer seemed to snap into action then, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his radio. "I need backup," he said into the mic, his voice sounding frantic now. "I need an ambulance now." The man's heart sank as he listened to the officer. The words were coming too late. The seconds felt like hours, and the officer's call for help didn't change the fact that they were still alone. It was just the two of them in this moment, and he couldn't rely on anyone else. He couldn't wait for help. He had to act. "Stay with me," he whispered again, his hand never leaving the wound. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so powerless. He had been through so much in his life, so many battles, so many moments where he had faced danger head-on, but nothing compared to this. Nothing had ever made him feel so helpless. His wife's breathing was growing weaker now, and he could feel her hand slipping from his. He tightened his grip, desperate not to lose her. She was his anchor, his rock, the person who had been there through it all. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. The officer, still talking into his radio, seemed to be getting more frantic with each passing second. The man could hear the officer's voice rise in pitch, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except his wife. She was slipping away, and the man could feel it in his gut. Every breath she took was one he wasn't sure she'd be able to take again. He had to think. He had to do something. He looked around, trying to find something, anything that could help him. But the gas station was still quiet. No one was coming. It was just him, his wife, and the officer who had started all of this. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing for a solution. He had been trained for this. He had been trained to handle impossible situations. But this wasn't just about survival. This was about his wife, the one person he couldn't live without. His eyes flicked to the officer again, but the man didn't have the energy to deal with him. His focus was entirely on his wife now. She needed him. She needed him to be strong, to do everything he could to save her. The officer was still talking into the radio, but the man blocked out the noise. He couldn't afford to think about what the officer might be doing. The only thing that mattered was his wife. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't lose her. Her breathing was becoming more labored now, and the man could feel his chest tightening with each shallow gasp she took. He could see the way her eyelids fluttered, the way her body seemed to grow more and more still. He knew she didn't have much time left. "Every second counted now, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please don't leave me." The words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. But he didn't give up. He pressed on, fighting with everything he had left. He would not let her go. Not without a fight. The sound of his wife's weak breaths was the only thing the man could hear now. It felt as though the world had gone quiet, as if everything had stopped moving around them. Her body was so still in his arms, and he could feel the heat of her blood now staining his clothes and hands. His heart raced in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of how little time they had left. The officer, still fumbling with his radio, seemed far away now, his presence fading into the background. Everything outside the circle of the man and his wife seemed irrelevant. He had been in life-threatening situations before, on missions, in the heat of battle, surrounded by enemies. But nothing had ever felt as raw and personal as this. Nothing had ever made him feel so helpless. His wife wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained for this kind of thing. She was just her, and he couldn't lose her. Not now. He had seen enough blood in his life to know what it meant when someone was bleeding out, but it didn't matter. This was different. She wasn't just another casualty in a faraway place. She was his everything. He had to fight for her. He couldn't just let her slip away. Her hand weakly twitched in his, and he squeezed it, offering what little comfort he could. "Stay with me," he whispered, though his voice trembled now, betraying the panic he was trying to hide. His fingers were slick with her blood, but he didn't let go. "I need you. Please stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered again, and for a brief moment she looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. He tried to smile, to reassure her, but it felt like he was losing her with every passing second. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The man's chest tightened, and he leaned in closer, his lips brushing her ear. "I love you," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he said it anyway. He needed to say it. He needed to believe that somehow she could hear him. The officer's voice broke through the silence, but it sounded distant, as though he were in a different world. "Help's on the way," the officer said, his voice shaky. "Just hold on, okay? Help's coming." The man barely registered the words. Help? How could he wait for help? His wife was dying right in front of him, and the seconds were slipping away like grains of sand. He needed to do something. He needed to take control of the situation. His training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, to act decisively, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He looked down at her again, his heart sinking as he saw the blood pooling around her. He had seen people die before. He had seen too many people die, but this was different. This wasn't some faceless stranger. This was his wife, the love of his life, and she was slipping away. The officer, now talking into his radio again, seemed to finally sense the urgency in the air. "We need an ambulance now," he shouted into the mic, his voice growing more desperate. "This is serious. She's not going to make it if we don't get help soon." The man felt the officer's words like a punch to the gut. She wasn't going to make it. He could feel it deep in his bones. He had seen this before. He had seen the signs. But he couldn't let that be the truth. He couldn't accept it. His mind raced as he searched for a solution. What could he do? There had to be something. He couldn't let her die like this. There had to be a way to save her. But the more he thought, the more desperate the situation seemed. His wife's breathing had become more shallow, each breath harder to take. Her skin was cold, her body growing weaker. The blood, so much blood, kept pouring from her wound, and it felt like there was nothing he could do to stop it. He glanced around again, hoping to see something. Anything that could help. But the gas station was still empty. The world outside their small circle still quiet. No one was coming. No one was here to help them. It was just the two of them, and the officer, who had finally backed away a few paces, still holding his radio to his mouth. "Please, please don't go," he whispered, his voice breaking as he leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I can't do this without you. I can't live without you." She didn't respond. Her hand slipped from his, and he felt the coldness spreading through her fingers, the warmth of her body beginning to fade. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest as he pressed down harder on her wound, desperate to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. He could feel her slipping away from him piece by piece. The officer was speaking again, his voice more urgent this time, but the man didn't care about the officer anymore. He had lost his focus on anything other than his wife. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not because of some mistake, some misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. He thought back to their life together, the way they had met, the years they had spent side by side building a life, building dreams. They had made plans. They had talked about growing old together. He had promised her that he would always protect her. And now here he was, unable to protect her from this, unable to stop the life draining out of her with every second that passed. "Please just stay with me," he begged, his voice barely audible. His eyes were filled with tears now, but he didn't care. He couldn't stop them. He didn't care about anything else except her. He didn't care about the officer or the world around them. All he cared about was saving her. Her body jerked suddenly, and he nearly lost his grip on her. His breath caught in his throat, but then he realized it wasn't the end. Not yet. She wasn't gone. She was still here. He wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. He shifted his position, trying to find a way to apply more pressure to her wound. He couldn't let her die. He wouldn't let her die. His hands were shaking, but he held her tighter, his mind refusing to accept the possibility that she might not make it. He wouldn't accept that. The officer was still standing there, his face pale as he watched the man struggle to keep his wife alive. The man could see the uncertainty in the officer's eyes now, could feel the shift in the air. The officer didn't know what to do, and in that moment the man realized that it was up to him. There was no one else coming. There was no one else who could save her. He had to save her. He had to fight for her. The seconds felt like hours. Every breath his wife took was a fragile thing, and with every one the man felt his own life slip further away. Her once strong presence, the woman who had always been so full of life, was now just a faint echo of herself. Her body was cold, her breathing shallow and uneven. The man's heart was pounding in his chest, the urgency of the moment overtaking everything else. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not now. Not when he was so close to losing everything. The officer, standing a few feet away, was still holding the radio to his mouth. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady as he spoke into the mic. "We need help now," he repeated, but the man couldn't hear him anymore. The officer's voice felt distant, meaningless. The man's entire world had narrowed down to his wife and the lifeblood that was slipping through his fingers. He leaned down closer to her, trying to block out everything else. "Stay with me," he whispered again, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. His voice was a plea, an unspoken promise. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't let her go. Her eyes fluttered open again, weakly searching for his face. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a strained breath. He could see the pain in her eyes, the confusion. She was fighting, but it was clear that her strength was fading. He needed to do something, anything, but there was nothing. His mind raced, trying to find some way to keep her alive. The bleeding, the wound, nothing was getting better. Every time he pressed down on it, it felt like it was only making things worse. He could see the blood staining his clothes, his hands slick with it. And yet, in his mind, he refused to believe that he couldn't save her. He couldn't let this be the end. He shifted his position again, pulling her closer to him, desperate for a connection. He needed to feel her warmth, to remind himself that she was still there. Still fighting. Her hand, still so limp in his, was losing its grip, but he refused to let go. He needed her to hold on just a little longer. Just a little longer until help arrived. He glanced up at the officer, who was still standing there, his eyes filled with something between shock and guilt. The man could see it now. The officer was realizing the magnitude of his mistake. He was realizing the consequences of his actions. But it was too late for apologies. It was too late for second chances. His wife was dying, and the officer had no idea how to fix it. The officer seemed to snap out of his daze, his hand still clutching the radio, but his gaze shifted between the man and his wife. The man could see the officer's struggle, the way he was wrestling with his own emotions. He was just a cop, not a doctor, and the situation had spiraled beyond anything he had been trained for. "We need to get her to a hospital," the officer said, his voice shaking now. The man didn't respond. What good would that do? How much time had already been wasted? The ambulance was still on its way, but who knew how long it would take? "No," the man said through gritted teeth, his voice barely a whisper. "She doesn't have time for a hospital. She doesn't have time for an ambulance." He shook his head, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. His wife needed help now, right now, and there was no one around who could provide it. There was no time left. The officer stepped forward, looking helpless, but the man didn't want to look at him. He didn't want to see the officer's regret. It wouldn't save his wife. It wouldn't change what had happened. His focus remained on the woman in his arms, the love of his life, and the fight that was slipping away from her with each shallow breath. "Please," the man whispered, trying to keep his composure even as his voice cracked. "Please don't leave me." Her chest rose and fell with such little effort, and it terrified him. Each breath was a miracle, and he wasn't sure how many more miracles they had left. His eyes moved desperately from her face to the officer, then back again. There was no time for blame. There was no time for anger. All that mattered was getting her the help she needed, and fast. For a moment he thought he might be able to keep it together. He thought that if he stayed focused, if he kept his mind sharp, he could get through this. But as he looked at his wife's face, as he saw the color draining from her skin, he felt a panic rising in his chest. He couldn't stop it. The thought of losing her was too much to bear. It was all he could think about. His hands were shaking, his breaths coming faster as he pressed against her wound with everything he had left. His entire body was consumed with the need to save her. Her breathing had become even more shallow, and the man's heart seemed to stutter with every beat. He didn't know what to do anymore. There was no instruction manual for this, no set of steps he could follow. It wasn't about being a soldier now. It wasn't about tactics or strategy. It was just about love, just about the woman he had promised to protect, the woman he had shared his life with. His hands trembled as he gently brushed her hair away from her face. "I love you," he whispered again, hoping somehow, against all odds, that his words could reach her. Maybe, just maybe, they would give her the strength to fight just a little longer. He couldn't let her go. He wouldn't, not like this. But the man knew that he was losing her. He could feel it deep in his gut. He had saved lives before, had been there to pull soldiers from the brink of death. But this was different. This was personal. This was his wife. And no amount of training or skill could change the fact that he might be too late. The officer's voice broke through his thoughts again, but this time it was softer, more hesitant. "I'm sorry," he said, his words quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I didn't know." The man didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Nothing would change what had happened. Nothing could undo the moment the officer had pulled the trigger. And yet somehow the man found that he didn't care about the officer's apologies. He didn't care about what the officer thought or felt. His only focus was his wife, her life, and it was slipping away faster than he could catch it. Another breath. Shallow. Another. Still weak. He held onto her, his grip tightening, his body shaking with the effort to stay composed. He couldn't show weakness, not now. Not when she needed him the most. But everything in him screamed that it was over, that he was losing her, but he refused to let go. He refused to accept that she was gone. He couldn't, not without fighting for every second. The silence was deafening. The world felt like it was holding its breath as the man clung to the woman in his arms, unwilling to accept the harsh reality that was setting in. Her once lively face, the face that had been a constant source of joy, was now pale and her eyes were barely open. Every breath she took seemed to cost more energy than the last, and he could feel her slipping further and further from him with each passing second. His own breathing had become ragged, shallow. His body was tense, trembling, but he couldn't afford to let his emotions take over. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance. A small chance. He couldn't let go. Not while there was still a flicker of life left in her. Her fingers, once firm in his grip, were growing cold. He squeezed her hand again, his knuckles white from the pressure, but she didn't respond. The warmth of her body was fading fast, and in its place was the terrifying coldness of a body that was giving up. His heart ached with every second that passed, but his mind refused to accept the truth. He couldn't let go. Not yet. The officer was still standing a few feet away, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of guilt, shock, and confusion. He had no words left to say. There was nothing left for him to do. His voice trembled as he spoke, but the man couldn't bring himself to listen anymore. There was no time for anyone else. There was only him and her. "Please," the officer said softly, his voice barely audible. "We've done everything we can. Help's on the way," but the man barely heard him. The words didn't matter. They were just words. Help. It was too late for help. His wife didn't need an ambulance anymore. What she needed was him. She needed his strength, his resolve. She needed him to be strong, even if it felt like the very foundation of his world was crumbling around him. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing her ear. "Please don't leave me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this without you. You're everything to me. Please fight. I'm right here." Her eyelids fluttered, a small, almost imperceptible movement. And for a fleeting moment, the man thought she might be holding on. He held his breath, his chest tight with hope. But then her eyes closed again and her body went limp in his arms. His heart stopped. The officer was still standing there, motionless, but the man didn't look at him. His entire focus was on the woman in his arms. His wife, the love of his life. The person who had been with him through everything. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. His chest tightened, a deep, suffocating pain wrapping around his ribs. He had been through so much, seen so many things, but none of it had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for the moment when the woman who meant everything to him was fighting for her life, and he was powerless to stop it. He pressed harder against her wound, his hands slick with blood. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of memories and emotions all crashing into each other. He thought about their life together, their dreams, the future they had planned. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't. Her hand twitched in his again, weakly, and he nearly collapsed with relief. For just a moment it felt like she was coming back, but her breath remained shallow, her body still so cold. The fight in her, the strength he had known her for, was slipping away. He had to act. He couldn't let her go. "Stay with me," he said through gritted teeth. "Please don't leave me." It was the hardest thing he'd ever done to keep himself composed in that moment. His heart was breaking, his body screaming for release, but he couldn't. Not when she needed him the most. He had been trained to control his emotions, to keep calm in the face of danger, but this was different. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't a battle. This was his wife, another breath. So shallow, so weak, but it was still there. And with that small breath, he held on to hope. Then the sound of sirens reached his ears. They were faint at first, distant but growing louder by the second. His eyes flicked up, his heart racing as he finally allowed himself to believe that help was on its way. But even then, a sinking feeling remained in his stomach. What if it was too late? What if the help that was coming was too little, too late? The officer turned toward the sound of the sirens, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion, but the man didn't move. He didn't let go. His hands were still firmly pressed against his wife's wound, trying desperately to stop the blood that had already soaked through their clothes. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the pressure, but he didn't care. As long as she was still breathing, as long as she was still alive, he would keep fighting for her. The ambulance arrived, its lights flashing, the paramedics rushing out of the vehicle, but the man couldn't move. His eyes were locked on his wife, and in that moment it felt like the entire world had disappeared. He was so focused on her, so focused on keeping her alive, that everything else was a blur. One of the paramedics approached quickly, kneeling beside the man. "Sir, we need to get her to the hospital. She's losing too much blood. We need to move now." The man didn't respond immediately. He couldn't tear his eyes away from his wife. Her face was so pale, so fragile, but there was still a flicker of life in her, just a flicker. But it was there. "I can't let go," he said, his voice raw with emotion. She's my everything. I can't lose her." The paramedic looked at him with compassion in his eyes, but there was no time for words. He gently placed his hand on the man's arm, guiding him away from his wife so they could work. "We're going to do everything we can," the paramedic said firmly. "But we need to move her now." Reluctantly, the man let go. His fingers, still covered in her blood, trembled as he watched the paramedics carefully lift her onto the stretcher. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no time for hesitation. He had to trust them. He had to let them do what they were trained to do. "Please," he whispered to her one last time, his voice barely audible. "Don't give up. Stay with me. I love you." The paramedics moved quickly, and the man followed them, his steps heavy and unsteady. He couldn't bring himself to look away from her. Not yet, not until she was safe. They rushed her to the ambulance, and the man climbed in beside her, never leaving her side. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The ambulance sped off into the night, the sound of the sirens filling the air. The man sat by his wife's side, holding her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. Her breathing was still shallow, but at least it was there. At least there was still a chance. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if she would make it. But as long as she was still fighting, he would fight with her. He had promised to protect her, to be there for her no matter what. And he would keep that promise. As the ambulance hurtled toward the hospital, the man's heart, though still heavy with fear, began to allow a small glimmer of hope to return. His wife wasn't gone yet. She was still with him. And as long as she was still with him, there was always a chance.